I just realised I've left something at my desk, which I'm going to need. So I'll be back in a couple of minutes.
There's a sink there. Maybe. A bit clumsy. What's the next one? Getting come out of here. Because I can research what she's talking about.
After that, I'm collecting sound
Did you look at the source material? Okay. Yeah. Quick. What were the questions again? These. Is Descartes to you the person that wrote this? Is Descartes to you the person that wrote this? Yeah. Okay. Got I think everyone, a lot more people have computers now. Get mine out. Yeah, that's what I do. Way too huge. I do this when it's just to like when she references something I can quickly take Facebook.
Do you have, I mean, can you bake?
bake. Yeah. Do you like baking? You know, next week, through Islamic Society, we're doing like bake sales to raise money for like orphans and children, like every day of the week. If you want, you can bake for us if you have time and stuff.
Same, yeah.
Yeah. You just like, because it's Islamic Society, they can't be like there can't be alcohol in it.
I don't cook with alcohol.
Some people do. They're like, there's one girl offered me a rum cake once, and I was just like, cool. And I was just like, what does that mean? Does it have rum in it? And she's like, I said it like 3 times, and I was like, I can't have that fun. But or gelatine. Do you know what gelatine is?
It's like crushed bones.
Yeah. If it's veg based.
I just use like sponge.
Cool. Yeah. That's what I was like doing just now. I was like printing off like leaflets and stuff. Hopefully we're gonna start like flyering and stuff because we'll have like a food market on the first day on the 27th. So
You should give them a You'd like them for the thing she said. I'm taking notes.
Have you thought about the volunteer thing?
which one do you think?
They were handing out leaflets all over the campus about the volunteer fair.
Oh, the people with the purple tops.
Yeah.
No one gave me leaflets. That's really sad.
They gave me a leaflet and said, and I said, oh thanks. They said no problem.
And what is it about?
It's just like volunteering for charity.
Me?
But then you need a CV, I'm right.
Can I see you?
I'm thinking, my parents are like, oh, get a new job. I'm like, maybe.
Do you still work the same days?
Just supposed to be Saturday. They tried making me cover this Tuesday. I'm like, no, I got you. And it's like, well, I double checked. And I'm like, I have you.
Is it recording?
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I always cut it. But
I'm lucky I didn't say any secrets.
So this week we've got Jake, who's back from Berlin with us, and okay. So this week we're going to be focusing on spatial practice, which is one of the concepts that we started to talk about last week when we were reading Harry Lefebvre's book, The Production of Space. So last week we did quite a lot of in-depth reading of Lefebvre, and this week we're going to do some quite close reading again of De Soto. I think it's they're kind of really two very kind of key texts that have had a sort of huge impact on kind of thinking about how we engage with urban space on a sort of day-to-day basis. And what I'm going to do is I've got a few images that I might sort of speak to as we read, and some other books that I'm going to mention that you might want to follow up on after the class, and then we'll kind of in the second half of the seminar kind of open things up a bit and look at some other artworks and images that will enable us to think about sort of implications of spatial practices. So last week we were reading Production of Space, and we reached the point at which Lefebvre was talking about the three concepts that of spatial practice, representations of space and representational spaces that he argues kind of work in this trialectical way, rubbing up against each other in a sort of constant process to produce space. So I thought maybe what would be helpful is just to kind of go over those, because in a way they do very much relate to the De Soto text, although and De Soto is also very much concerned with representations of space and also the way in which urban practices relate to a sort of idea of the unconscious, because both of those writers were very much influenced by psychoanalysis. So we can talk about that a little bit more. So let's just kind of go over and remind ourselves of how we understood those three terms. Jake, you said you were going to read those texts, so this is also a chance for you to kind of join in and catch up. So spatial practices. What does Lefebvre mean by spatial practice? What do you remember about the discussion that we had about that?
So kind of like using the spaces, but like how we occupy them instead of what they may be meant to be built for or something.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's about, spatial practice is about the way in which people use space, often without thinking about it, right? So the way in which we go to and from work, but also the way in which we use domestic space, but also the way in which, that people might use space in ways that they are not designed for, and that has a certain kind of power and agency to it that may not be a kind of conscious power. So there are ways in which people use space in a very, think about like a political protest, that's a very conscious use of space for a particular end. But there are ways in which people use space without really thinking about it that has a certain kind of, a certain sort of set of effects over time, perhaps over a long period. I was talking to a woman over the weekend who'd just been on a pilgrimage in Spain to San Sebastian, which is something that people have done over hundreds of years. And I remember going there myself, and the stone pillars on the church actually have this shape, which is more or less of a hand, from millions of people over the years pressing down on this rock. And it seemed to me that was a very interesting kind of image of this relationship between the kind of fragile body and kind of apparently sort of permanent kind of material. But we were also talking about examples like the South Bank, weren't we, where skateboarders made a space for skateboarding without it having been designed as such. Other things about spatial practice that are important to recall. I was just mentioning psychoanalysis just now, and it's sort of possible to more or less map Lefebvre's concepts of spatial practice, representations of space and representational spaces onto his ideas of the unconscious, the imaginary, and the sort of the ego, if you like. So in that case, spatial practice is a bit like the unconscious. It's something that kind of takes place that we're not necessarily in command of. Okay, representations of space. What does Lefebvre mean by representations of space? What are examples of representations of space?
Was that as in like structure, like formally here, like a physical, like this desk is here and that, or was that the other way around?
What do other people think?
Wasn't it to do with like maps and how you see that it's like geographical in terms of the map, and where you represent, like say London Bridge, you represent it by a building, which is a shard, and you kind of, even though it's not completely the right distance, but you just kind of visualize it within the map where things are.
Okay, so a map is a good example of representation of space, but it's more like, I think, the way in which space is imagined kind of ideally, if you like. I think that's kind of more or less the phrase that Lefebvre uses. So it's the space of maps, of all kinds of representations of space, be it advertising, architectural plans as well. So those are all representations of space which feed into how space gets produced, right? There's not, in a way, a sort of real space somehow and then the representations of it. The way in which we experience space is a kind of combination of those. So representational spaces is the third category that Lefebvre talks about, and we sort of found that was in a way one of the most difficult to grasp. What do you remember about representational spaces and what Lefebvre means by that?
It's the space of like imagination and fantasy and the kind of I guess like kind of less concrete projections.
Yeah, so symbolism,
Yeah.
myth, the space of myth in a way, space of memory, the space of sort of a kind of inhabitation of space. Okay. And I mean, one of the things that links all of those three is a kind of focus on the body. So in a way, this is one of the ways in which Lefebvre is trying to get away from a kind of classical understanding of space as some kind of empty container that human activity unfolds within, right? What he's saying is actually there's a constant process of spatial production that goes on through our inhabitation of spaces and our making of them. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do some reading of De Certeau and kind of just break off whenever the need arises to kind of unpack some of his ideas. Have you read any writings by him before? Do you know this writer? Heard of him before? Right, okay. I mean, he's really incredibly important as a theorist of everyday life. So, again, like Lefebvre, a lot of his writing has had a huge impact sort of post-1968, post the sort of upheavals and ferment of 68. And he wrote this chapter is from a vast book called The Practices of Everyday Life. And it's a sort of multi-volume book, which, you know, there are sort of chapters on cooking, there are chapters on all different kinds of things, and it's really an attempt to sort of think about how to kind of conceptualize and understand kind of everyday activities that in a way sort of evade knowledge because we don't often think about them. So what we'll sort of let's just launch into this text, and if you have any questions or things that you think are important that you want us to linger on, then just say. Okay, so I'm just going to start from reading from the first page. Seeing Manhattan from the 110th floor of the World Trade Center, beneath the haze stirred up by the winds, the urban island, a sea in the middle of the sea, lifts up the skyscrapers over Wall Street, sinks down at Greenwich, and rises again to the crest of Midtown, quietly passes over Central Park, and finally undulates off into the distance beyond Harlem, a wave of verticals. Its agitation is momentarily arrested by vision. The gigantic mass is immobilized before the eyes. It is transformed into a texturology in which extremes coincide, extremes of ambition and degradation, brutal oppositions of races and styles, contrast between yesterday's buildings, already transformed into trash cans, and today's urban eruptions that block out its space. Unlike Rome, New York has never learnt the art of growing old by playing on all of its pasts. Its present invents itself from hour to hour in the act of throwing away its previous accomplishments and challenging the future. A city composed of paroxysmal places in monumental reliefs. The spectator can read in it a universe that is constantly exploding. In it are inscribed the architectural figures of the coincidatio oppositorum, formerly drawn in miniatures and mystical textures. On this stage of concrete, steel and glass, cut out by two oceans, the Atlantic and the American, by a frigid body of water, the tallest letters in the world compose a gigantic rhetoric of excess in both expenditure and production. Okay, so what's happening in this opening paragraph? What's he describing?
He's on top of the old World Trade Center, which is now obviously gone,
Yes.
looking out at New York.
Yes.
I don't know if it's too much of a tangent, but reading this, I thought it was really interesting, looking at something from before that collapse, obviously, and now, like, if we're thinking about space, what that is now, the World
Yes.
Trade Center area.
What have you been there since they've?
I went to New York, but I didn't go there. I was quite young.
Yes. Has anyone been to New York since it was reopened? There's a very nice work by Shelley Silver called What I'm Looking For, which is a film made up of still photographs, which has a lot of it's about sort of public memory and sort of what it means to. It's sort of about the anonymity of public space and the sort of strange intimacies you can find online. So the protagonist is an artist who puts out this advert online for people who are being willing to be photographed in public space, revealing something about themselves. And it's about the various sort of misunderstandings and misadventures she has while doing this. And one of the characters is a Japanese tourist who wants to be photographed at the foot of the World Trade Center. And so it's quite an interesting work to think about, actually, in relation to these themes. But yeah, it's a sort of, obviously it's not a view that we can ever experience again, right? It's a sort of iconic view. What sort of strikes you about the way in which he describes that?
It kind of makes it sound like a sea, like, I don't know, he kind of sees it as like an entire like thing of itself instead of lots of different areas, or I don't know, it just feels like it flows more. And which, like you said, kind of, I was interested like how there is like an empty space where the two towers and like the World Trade Center would have been, and they're empty, and how like the city is kind of like almost human or like alive, and how it's like always changing, even though like you'd think that these concrete hard things would stay longer than us, but they might not.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So the way he's describing this scene, it gives the kind of urban fabric, in a way, a sort of autonomy of its own. There's a book which you might find interesting by the architect Rem Koolhaas called Delirious New York, and it's he wrote it quite some time ago, and he was very interested in the development of the kind of form of Manhattan, which we kind of take for granted now, but he's interested in the kind of early moment of building high-rises, when, I mean, it's not like the World Trade Center in that most of the buildings in Manhattan which were built in the sort of 1940s were not by named architects. It was a really sort of pragmatic decision to build upwards because of a lack of space in Manhattan. And so Koolhaas is fascinated by the way in which this is a sort of unconscious aesthetic form, the high-rise, and he has some really, in Delirious New York, there are really interesting illustrations, some of them quite funny, that he uses. So one of the things he points out is that the form of the high-rise, there's a kind of indifference between what happens on each floor. And so, you know, you can have completely different things happening on each floor. There's no sort of coherence to it. I mean, the other thing about it, which I think is one of the to-do, obviously, with why the World Trade Center was chosen for that terrorist attack, because it was, you know, it's at the sort of, I mean, De Soto describes it as like the prow of a boat, doesn't he? It's sort of the pinnacle of Manhattan. So there's something kind of phallic about that form, which obviously, you know, the reason why symbolically that terrorist attack had such power was because it was about a sort of aesthetic, in a way, attack, as much as it was about kind of, financial destruction, loss of life, and so on. There was a symbolic violence there. This is an illustration from Rebecca Koolhaas's book, which I think is quite funny. So I'm so sorry about the quality of this illustration. It was all I could find in the time that I had. But if you look at the book, you'll see it. So Rebecca Koolhaas's wife did a lot of the illustrations for the book, and there what you see is two of the buildings sort of lying on a bed post-coital in this room that looks out over Manhattan, and there's another building, I can't remember which one it is, that's come in and has caught them in the act. So the book is sort of full of these kind of funny comments and deflations of the kind of the ego of architecture, if you like. So what else can we say about this passage? What happens? What's the drama of this paragraph? You have this sea of Manhattan, this undulating form. What happens?
Maybe like the sense of movement. I think it seems like it's sort of in its own sense away from the space. It seems like it's trying to say it as actually something not living but like experience. It's it intersects and it can't necessarily be distinct like that.
Mm-hmm. And at a certain point he says, a wave of verticals, its agitation is momentarily arrested by vision. The gigantic mass is immobilized before the eyes. It is transformed into a texturology in which extremes coincide. So what's happening there? What does the vision of it enable? This vision from high up. It stops it. It enables a certain kind of capture to take place. Rather than a sort of chaos, there's a way in which a pattern emerges. He uses this word texturology, which is an interesting word. I'm not sure if it exists outside of this text. But what do you think why do you think he uses that word? What does it mean for you?
It made me think of fractals, how if you magnify down into the floor here, you'd see a kind of pattern or organisation that's very mathematical, and it feels like he's almost bird's eye viewing out of the city and seeing it again but on a grander scale or something. That you could almost zoom out of the world and see it again and again, almost in microscopic and far away. That's what it kind of came across to me.
So there's something that's apparent from this high up position that he is speaking from, that isn't visible otherwise. This word texturology, I think it's interesting. On the one hand, if you think about the etymology of texture, it's related to the idea of textile, to cloth, weaving, but also to text. And one of the things that he's doing is comparing the urban space to writing. Okay, the buildings become letters. The tallest letters in the world compose a gigantic rhetoric of excess in both expenditure and production. Okay. So they become a sort of, the city he's reading it as if it's a text. It's become legible.
It's almost like the ideology becomes more legible from that angle.
Mm-hmm.
It almost seems like in the last sentence.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's an ideology to architectural form.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's go over the page. To what erotics of knowledge does the ecstasy of reading such a cosmos belong? Having taken a voluptuous pleasure in it, I wonder what is the source of this pleasure of seeing the whole, of looking down on, totalizing the most immoderate of human texts. To be lifted to the summit of the World Trade Center is to be lifted out of the city's grasp. One's body is no longer clasped by the streets that turn and return it according to an anonymous law, nor is it possessed, whether as player or play, by the rumble of so many differences and by the nervousness of New York traffic. When one goes up there, he He leaves behind the mass that carries off and mixes up in itself any identity of authors and spectators. And Icarus, flying above these waters, he can ignore the devices of Daldaeus, immobile and endless labyrinths far below. His elevation transfigures him into a voyeur. It puts him at a distance. It transforms the bewitching world by which one was possessed into a text that lies before one's eyes. It allows one to read it, to be a solar eye, looking down like a god. The exaltation of a scopic and Gnostic drive, the fiction of knowledge, is related to this lust to be a viewpoint and nothing more. What's he saying here?
Saying like, I don't know, I think he's maybe saying like out of the motion that he can look down on, that's when like, well, this viewpoint is possible. Like without that, like, you know, you can't literally see like this certain angle, and like it's free of, like it's not constrained by like the by what he's looking at. In a sense.
What do you think? Why do you think he talks about it in terms of pleasure? And what kind of pleasure is he talking about?
Maybe of having like an insight that no one else has, like on the bottom level, because he's got like this power now to be able to kind of like see everyone, and they're probably unaware that he can see them as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes.
I think it might be like, do you know when someone just kind of gets uplifted and has so much power, they seem to be all knowing and all seeing. I think he has this kind of godlike figure upon that, and that gives him pleasure that, you know, and it keeps going, that he needs to see and view things in that certain way, and it makes sense to him because he's up high.
So there's this viewpoint, this ability to be able to see is to do with a position of, it relates to a position of power, right? And there's two kinds of desire that he talks about. The exaltation of a scopic and Gnostic drive. The fiction of knowledge is related to this lust to be a viewpoint and nothing more. What does that mean? Do we know what that means?
Like being able to, or like having the illusion that you can see things from an objective point of view.
Yeah, so
that you can like be, I don't know, that you like don't have to be seeing everything through the lens of your subject position, but there is some way of seeing outside of that.
And there's two kinds. There's the pleasure of looking. There's an idea of pleasure attached to looking, which is the scopic drive, and the Gnostic drive, which is a drive towards knowledge. And here the two kind of fuse, right? And what's the myth that he's referring to here of Icarus?
Right.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So Icarus in Greek mythology he escaped from a prison by constructing some wings and flying, but he was so vain and so proud of his achievements, he flew too high, got too close to the sun, and the wax that was holding the feathers together in his wings melted, and he fell into the sea and drowned. So it's a kind of parable, in a way, that he's also talking about. But there's also, I think there's something very interesting as well. One's body is no longer clasped by the streets. So what you've got here is a very kind of erotic language with which he's describing the relationship between one's position in the city, vis-a-vis the city, and looking. So we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. Okay, I'll read on. One must finally fall back into the dark space where crowds move back and forth, crowds that, though visible from on high, are themselves unable to see down below, an Icarian fall. On the 110th floor, a poster, sphinx-like, addresses an enigmatic message to the pedestrian who is for an instant transformed into a visionary. It's hard to be down when you're up. The desire to see the city precedes the means of satisfying it. Medieval or Renaissance painters represented the city as seen in a perspective that no eye had yet enjoyed. This fiction already made the medieval spectator into a celestial eye. It created gods. Have things changed since the technical procedures have organised an all-seeing power? The totalising eye, imagined by the painters of earlier times, lives on in our achievements. The same scopic drive haunts users of architectural productions by materialising today the utopia that yesterday was only painted. The 1,370-foot high tower that serves as the prow for Manhattan continues to construct the fiction that creates readers, makes the complexity of the city readable, and immobilises its opaque mobility in a transparent text. Okay, so what's he claiming here? Remember last week when we were talking about transparency in Lefebvre?
You talk about a view that has forever been impossible that he is now realising in reality.
Absolutely, yes, but it's one that also positions you in certain ways, isn't it? So if you think about Renaissance paintings, particularly those sort of quite architectural paintings of urban spaces, city squares and so on, where the lines of perspective are kind of overplayed and they position the viewer in certain ways, right? If you think about like Holbein's Ambassadors, which in order to make sense of that painting and to understand the sort of morality tale that it's telling with the skull that's elongated across it, you have to stand from a specific position. So he's talking about what in a way might be described as an effect of power. This viewing position makes the reader of the city, gives the reader of the city this kind of feeling of elation, of escape from the kind of confusion of the streets. Okay.
Kind of like an illusion of power, though. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it's not related to anything. Like, that's why it's like a God view. Do you know?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So in that sense, it's like, yeah.
There's something that, I mean, remember when we talked about last week about the illusion of transparency, the idea that you can grasp something, understand it by looking at it, by appearing to be legible. And as we'll see, De Soto is quite suspicious of text, actually. I mean, he's also talking about a certain idea of humanism, that places human subjectivity in the centre. And you'll notice all the way through this text, he keeps going back to ideas of expenditure and production. So he's interested in the whole system, all the waste and stuff that gets left out usually. Okay, let's turn over. I'll just begin from the page 92. Is the immense texturology spread out before one's eyes anything more than a representation, an optical artifact? It is the analogue of the facsimile produced through a projection that is a way of keeping aloof by the space planner, urbanist, city planner or cartographer. The panorama city is a theoretical, that is visual simulacrum. In short, a picture whose conditions of possibility is an oblivion and misunderstanding of practices. The voyeur god, created by this fiction, who, like Schreber's god, knows only cadavers, must disentangle himself from the murky intertwining of daily behaviour and make himself alien to them. So what's the problem that he's identifying? What's this introduction been kind of leading up to?
Is it that, like, by inhabiting the space outside, there's like, you have this illusion of being able to see more, but there's also lots of things that you can't see and can't access?
Yes. Yeah. So in a way, I mean, rather like Lefebvre, they're writing at a moment where the kind of the modernist utopian visions of urban planning that had sort of begun in the late 19th century, the idea of urban planning as something that would alleviate urban problems and that one could create spaces in which could transform social relations, is coming under attack. People are disillusioned with a kind of utopian urbanist vision and are trying to sort of think about how you can understand what's left out from those utopian visions. I mean, it's interesting that we're in this moment at the moment when a lot of social housing in this country is being knocked down, right? A lot of brutalist architecture is being demolished, and there's I think a sort of belated recognition that there was a sort of ethics involved in that urban design, which for a long time wasn't recognised because the architecture was blamed for the social problems around it. Okay, let's go on. The ordinary practitioners of the city live down below the thresholds at which visibility begins. They walk, an elementary form of this experience of the city. They are walkers, Wander's manner, whose bodies follow the thicks and thins of an urban text they write without being able to read it. These practitioners make use of spaces that cannot be seen. Their knowledge of them is as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. The paths that correspond in this intertwining, unrecognised poems in which each body is an element signed by many others elude legibility. It is as though the practices organising a bustling city were characterised by their blindness. The networks of these moving, intersecting writings compose a manifold story that has neither author nor spectator, shaped out of fragments of trajectories and alterations of spaces. In relation to representations, it remains daily and indefinitely other. So what's being said here? What can we say about this passage? How's he beginning to characterise social practice?
Like in conjunction with like body, or like but with the language as well, like the
I don't know. Is he trying to kind of say that we are applying in terms of like we're robots, that we just do things but not really realise what we're doing, and we just do it because it's just the way we do it. It's just like we're programmed to do it in a certain way. I don't know.
Well,
I felt like it was less robots because, I don't know, it says something about like as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. It seems more like it's sensory or something, like we are feeling our way through the city, but because we know it so well or something, or we know our, like, you walk to school like every day for 3 years, then you just don't do it without thinking, and it's something you feel instead of like robotic movements, I suppose. But that's just why.
I think there's definitely a sensory, I mean, it's a very sensuous description, isn't it, of the movements of practitioners, right? I mean, it's interesting, there's this dichotomy that is set up between practitioners and theoreticians, right? The theoreticians are the urban planners, the cartographers.
What do you mean by a cartographer?
Cartographer is somebody who makes maps.
Oh.
So, and the practitioners could be anyone, right? There's a sort of anonymity that he's describing as well. And I think one of the things that, I think the reason why you thought of robots is perhaps because there's something sort of automatic and involuntary about what the way in which he's describing what urban practices produce, right? There's a production that's taking place which isn't necessarily devised by one consciousness. It's something that's taking place through a sort of mass unconscious, if you like. And they start to make certain kinds of texts, but it's not the texts of it's poems. There's a sort of poetics to it. And why do you think he describes them as poems, the patterns that?
Because they're like rhythm and time and is all sort of interchangeable, and it's not like, it's also caused by things indirectly, so it's not like something you can, like something you live in, I guess, and like you move between and with each other.
It's something voluntary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and perhaps not entirely captured by a sort of utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I think that's important to note is, at the end of that paragraph, the networks of these moving, intersecting writings compose a manifold story that has neither author nor spectator, shaped out of fragments of trajectories and alterations of spaces. In relation to representations, it remains daily and indefinitely other. So it's something that evades capture somehow. Escaping the imaginary totalizations produced by the eye, the everyday has a certain strangeness that does not surface, or whose surface is only its upper limit, outlining itself against the visible. Within this ensemble, I shall try to locate the practices that are foreign to the geometrical or geographical space of visual, panoptic, or theoretical constructions. These practices of space refer to a specific form of operations, ways of operating, to another spatiality, an anthropological, poetic, and mythic experience of space, and to an opaque and blind mobility characteristic of the bustling city, a migrational or metaphorical city that slips into the clear text of the planned and readable city. So, what does panoptic mean? Is that a phrase that you're familiar with?
It's, I mean, like, I know Foucault uses it it's to describe this prism design where there's a tower in the middle and everything's organised around it. So you basically, the idea is that you can't tell when you're being watched, so you act as if you're being watched all of the time.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Is that something that you've looked at in other seminars? You heard of the panopticon before, or the idea of it? Okay, it's a really really important idea that Foucault theorised. I'm going to just lower that slide so you can see. This is an image of a panopticon prison that was built in Cuba. So I think this image is just a really good illustration. So the first first design for a panopticon prison was by Jeremy Bentham, who was a sort of Victorian philosopher, utilitarian. It's interesting because Foucault wrote about Bentham extensively in one of the chapters of his book, Discipline and Punish. And if you have time, I really recommend having a look at that book, especially if you're interested in questions around surveillance and so on. It's an idea that we'll come back to again and again. And so basically what Foucault does is he describes this transition from societies which where the elite depended for social control on spectacular acts of violence and brutality. So public beheading, public hangings, beheadings, and so on, and also on spectacular displays of power, so pageantry. To something that Foucault comes to call a society of control, wherein the panopticon prison becomes a sort of metaphor for the way in which increasingly control is exercised through a kind of internal policing, whereby people sort of police themselves. So there's forms of coercion that are kind of saturated into our subjectivity. So the way in which, sorry, I can't remember your name. Amy. The way in which Amy described it. So what Bentham wanted to do was to create actually a more sort of humane form of prison, one that would be less cruel. And the panopticon design depended upon having these sort of units of prison cells which had a window at either side, and then this tower in the middle. And the idea was that you would have a guard in the middle of the watchtower, and that rather like some kind of so that any figure in the prison cell would always be visible to the prison guard, but the prisoners can't see the prison guard. Okay, so the prison guard doesn't actually even have to be there for the prisoner to feel like they're being watched. So that was the sort of genius of Bentham's prison design, is that you no longer had to use violence to compel people to do what you wanted them to do. you needed only the idea that they were being watched all time.
What's the prison called?
The Panopticon is the kind of design. If you go to Dublin, they have a Panopticon prison which was built by the British that you can actually do a tour of. It's really, really interesting. This one actually is in Cuba and I don't know the name of it, I'm afraid. But there were numerous ones that were built. So panoptic power is precisely to do with this idea that you are perhaps being watched, right? And remember last week we were talking about glass transparency and how the meaning of glass in buildings has shifted over time. So we were talking about Bauhaus, the very famous art school where in the Bauhaus buildings, glass-sided buildings were the kind of symbolism of them is to do with transparency and interdisciplinarity and communication. And glass in buildings has taken on a very different function. So if you think about a lot of the buildings in the City of London, the glass there isn't transparent. It isn't glass you can see through, it's mirrored. So people who are on the inside of the building can see out, but you can't see in. So in a way there's going to be a complete reversal of the sort of symbolism of glass in buildings, and that's to do with the shifting of power relations as well. Okay, so we'll come back to that idea of panopticism quite a few times. I'm going to let's move on a little bit. So as I said, one of the things that De Soto is critiquing is the association of utopian planning and vision with knowledge. Okay, and he's thinking, okay, how can we think differently about special practices that perhaps evade those forms of capture? If we go on to page 94, the section that's called an operational concept, De Soto kind of starts to unpack the idea of the city in utopian urbanistic discourses. I think I'll just skip through that unless there are very specific questions, and go on to just this last paragraph of that page. So, administration is combined with a process of elimination in this place organised by speculative and classificatory operations. On the one hand, there is a differentiation and redistribution of the parts and functions of the city as a result of inversions, displacements, accumulations, etc. On the other, there is a rejection of everything that is not capable of being dealt with in this way, and so constitutes the waste products of a function of city administration: abnormality, deviance, illness, death, etc. To be sure, progress allows an increasing number of these waste products to be reintroduced into administrative circuits and transforms even deficiencies in health, security, etc., into ways of making networks more defensive. But in reality, it repeatedly produces effects contrary to those at which it aims. The profit system generates a loss which, in the multiple forms of wretchedness and poverty outside the system and of waste inside it, constantly turns production into expenditure. What does he mean there? So the kind of utopian urban planning he associates with various forms of administration. Okay, how is he characterising that?
It's saying that like everything's split into like categories and stuff, and then there's people at the top that are distributing and redistributing, and it's kind of like a hierarchy of like roles and stuff. But then there's things. But when he says like abnormality, deviance, illness, and death, is he talking about like natural occurrences that the system operators like just can't kind of dictate because it's not in their hands, sort of thing? But then they attempt to do it through like, I don't know, hospitals and medicine and stuff, I guess. But then still it's not in the hands, but it just looks like it's in the hands, something like that, like a facade of like
Yes.
property or something.
I think, yeah, so you absolutely, so the administration, city administration and urban planning seeks to distribute specific roles and parts to organise urban life, right, in all its forms. So, but there's something that that the waste products of that can't cope with, even though it might claim to, and what more do you think? What else do you think is important here? The profit system generates a loss which, in the multiple forms of wretchedness and poverty outside the system and of waste inside it, constantly turns production into expenditure. How does that? How are you understanding that?
Is it like in a kind of attempt to like assimilate elements or factors that would be like contrary to production? It like, I don't know, that the like the attempts to do that are kind of always seen as a kind of form of loss rather than something productive. So like spending on like social services is seen as being like a burden, I guess, and rather than like something which is like important in and of itself.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I think the key thing here is he talks about the profit system, right? So what is constituted as waste, what is constituted as deviance, and so on, is always up for debate. And I think one of the ideas that he's drawing on here is Bataille's notion of the general economy. So Bataille had this idea that in order to understand a kind of system, you needed to look at everything within it, not just that which is lies within the realm of, say, official legal structures and legal economies and so on, but you need to look at the whole thing because there are systems within that. If you think about, say, for instance, think about production, right? And if you sort of think about, say, illegal labour or unofficial casual forms of labour, that completely changes how you understand profit and the economy. And we were talking about housing just now, and we have a housing system that's has changed radically over the last 30 years. So that means that there are huge numbers of people who are being displaced particularly out of London, right? And so there's a way in which the kind of profit system and administration would rather treat that as sort of excess as waste and so on. Okay. Let's move on to this last section of that, last paragraph of that section. Today, whatever the avatars of this concept may have been, we have to acknowledge that if in discourse the city serves as a totalising and almost mythical landmark for socio-economic and political strategies, urban life increasingly permits the re-emergence of the elements that the urbanistic project excluded. The language of power is in itself urbanising, but the city is left prey to contradictory movements that counterbalance and combine themselves outside the reach of panoptic power. The city becomes the dominant theme in political legends, but it is no longer a field of programmed and regulated operations. Beneath the discourses that ideologise the city, the ruses and combinations of powers that have no readable identity proliferate. Without points where one can take hold of them, without rational transparency, they are impossible to administer. Okay.
When it says rational transparency, again, like, what's it mean? Like, what was that? What was he referring to? Rational transparency. Sorry, in the last bit.
Yes.
I don't know what he's like. What I mean.
Okay, what do we... Hello.
I'm doing a audit room check.
Okay. So we're being checked on to make sure that the rooms we book we're actually using. Because there's a shortage of space and they need to make sure we're using it efficiently, which seems like a very appropriate intervention into this class. Okay, so let's look at this last. What does rational transparency here? What does he mean?
Like methods of making things like legible and like categorizing them and kind of just like forms of like outside understanding, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. But I think what he means is he's talking about sort of forms of excess outside of planned and beyond the sort of scope of planned and administered places. So you think about, like, for example, say graffiti or something, which has takes its power from the fact that it's sort of out of place, that it has a sort of that it's not supposed to be there, right? And yet it's also something that is, as increasingly in daily life it gets appropriated and so on, it becomes a sort of marker of a certain kind of area and so on. What are other examples that might help us to understand what he means?
Like cruising.
That's really good. Expecting.
Does anyone not know what it is? Do I need to? Like people like looking for sex in public places. Yeah.
So like also in that sense, like the extension of the space can be like, so it could be like someone climbing effectively to the top of the building without asking them to do it.
Yeah.
So that's okay.
Yeah. So any kind of I suppose what De Soto is interested in is partly the sort of banal movements of the city, but also all of those sort of I suppose within the realm of spatial practices, also the kind of way in which there's a certain sort of artistry to spatial practice. There are certain styles to it, right? There's certain ways in which, and we'll get on to talk about that later. There's a way in which spatial practice is more than just the sort of the function that it serves, right? Okay, let's carry on, and we'll get on to this section where he talks about goes into spatial practice in a bit more detail, because I think that will help to make this clearer. Okay, I'm just going to read a bit from the next section. The return of practices. The concept city is decaying. Does that mean that the illness afflicting both the rationality that founded it and its professionals afflicts the urban populations as well? Perhaps cities are deteriorating along with the procedures that organise them, but we must be careful here. The ministers of knowledge have always assumed that the whole universe was threatened by the very changes that affected their ideologies and their positions. They transmute the misfortune of their theories into theories of misfortune. and when they transform their bewilderment into catastrophes, when they seek to enclose the people in the panic of their discourses, are they once more necessarily right? Rather than remaining within the field of a discourse that upholds its privilege by inverting its content, speaking of catastrophe and no longer of progress, one can try another path. One can analyse the microbe-like, singular and plural practices which an urbanistic system was supposed to administer and or suppress, but which have outlived its decay. One can follow the swarming activity of these procedures that, far from being regulated or eliminated by panoptic administration, have reinforced themselves in a proliferating illegitimacy, developed and insinuated themselves into networks of surveillance, and combined in accord with unreadable but stable tactics to the point of constituting everyday regulations and surreptitious creativities that are merely concealed by the frantic mechanisms and discourses of the observational organisation. So, one of the ways in which we can see kind of spatial practice in a very obvious way is where you have kind of weak state administration and so on. And there was a project that Rem Koolhaas, who I was talking about earlier, did a few years ago in terms of this big study of Lagos. And there's some quite interesting documentaries in the library which you can look up about that project that he did. So Rem Koolhaas became fascinated by Lagos because it was a city with millions and millions of inhabitants, one of the largest cities in the world, but with, after many years of civil war, barely any state infrastructure. So what Koolhaas was interested in wasn't the sort of usual narratives of despair that Western media tends to use when depicting African cities, but rather the way in which Lagos as a city managed to support all of these millions of lives without apparently the structures in place to do it, without the infrastructures, right? And one of the things that's interesting, if you look at some of the documentary about the Lagos research, is that he says when the first few times he went to Lagos, he didn't know how to take photographs of it. It seems like he took photographs in the middle distance, and they didn't reveal anything about it. And what he and his photographers found was that either by zooming right in or zooming right out, you got a much better understanding of how urban space was operating, and indeed they used a lot of aerial photographs to try and understand spatial practices. So, for example, a train on a train track breaking down, which is a kind of a system going wrong, right, becomes an opportunity to set up a makeshift marketplace where you sell products to the people on the train, right? And so what they did was they ended up tracking all sorts of things like that, which, in order to produce a sort of body of knowledge about how that urban space worked as a system, right? Okay, and one of the things he's talking about in this section is the way in which discourses of control might, in a sort of situation where their sort of lack of grasp of power is becoming more apparent, might justify kind of increasing control through kind of citing catastrophe and so on. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Would anyone be prepared to read the first paragraph on page 97?
Yeah, right. The chorus of idle footsteps. The goddess can be recognized by her step. Their story begins on ground level with footsteps. They are a myriad, but do not compose a series. They cannot be counted because each unit has a qualitative character, a style of tactile apprehension and kinesthetic appropriation. Their swarming mass is an innumerable collection of singularities. Their intertwined paths give their shape to spaces. They weave places together. In that respect, pedestrian movements form one of these real systems whose existence in fact makes up the city. They are not localized. It is rather they that spatialize. They are no more inserted within a container than those Chinese character speakers sketched out on their hands with their fingertips. Should I carry on?
That'd be great, yeah.
Oh. It is true that the operations of walking on can be traced on city maps in such a way as to transcribe their paths, here well trodden, there very faint, and their trajectories going this way and not that. But these thick or thin curves only refer, like words, to the absence of what has passed by. Surveys of routes miss what was, the act itself of passing by. The operation of walking, wandering, or window shopping, that is, the activity of passers-by, is transformed into points that draw a totalizing and reversible line on the map. They allow us to grasp only a relic certain and like no one of a surface of projection. Itself visible, it has the effect of making invisible the operation that made it possible. These fixations constitute procedures for forgetting. The trace left behind is substituted for the practice. It exhibits the voracious property that the geographical system has of being able to transform action into legibility, but in doing so, it causes a way of being in the world to be forgotten.
Thank you. Great. So what's he saying here? How do you understand this paragraph?
But the like representation is always an abstraction that's kind of disguising what's actually happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So it is self-visible. It has the effect of making invisible the operation that made it possible. These fixations constitute procedures for forgetting. So again, there's a kind of distinction drawn up between something that's sensory, that's bodily, that's perhaps also acoustic, footsteps, and how it gets rendered in writing, in a graphic representation, and it's represented here as a form of loss. We'll just read a little bit more on the next page, and then we'll take a little break and then move on to look at some other materials. Pedestrian speech acts. A comparison with the speech act will allow us to go further and not limit ourselves to the critique of graphic representations alone, looking from the shores of legibility towards an inaccessible beyond. The act of walking is to the urban system what the speech act is to language and to statements uttered. At the most elementary level, it has a triple enunciative function. It is the process of appropriation of topographical system on the part of the pedestrian, just as the speaker appropriates and takes on language. It is a spatial acting out of the place, just as the speech act is an acoustic acting out of language, and it implies relations among differentiated positions, that is, among pragmatic contracts in the form of movements, just as verbal enunciation is an allocution, posits another opposite, the speaker, and puts contracts between the interlocutors into action. It thus seems possible to give a preliminary definition of walking as an enunciation of space, as a space of enunciation. So what's he claiming here about this relationship between spatial practice and speech and language? What's the claim? How is walking like? Walking in relation to space, like speech in relation to language.
He's saying that a space only becomes a space when people use it. Like you activate the play, you use the stage and
Yes.
become something.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that word that you use, activation, is really, really important one actually. So the way communication, if you think about it, is very much more than language, right? It's very much more than just the words that you say. There's a whole series of things that, particularly in face-to-face communication, right? It's one of the reasons why emails often lead to so much trouble, is that there's a sort of forms of expression that take place, and it's interesting because for instance, if you have autism, it's very hard to read facial expressions. My son's autistic, and he he has difficulty understanding certain sort of nuances of meaning because he can't read social situations so quickly. So if you think about it, a lot of things that we understand are to do with very subtle sort of tone of voice, expressions, body language, position of the body, and so on. And so what Seto is saying is that spatial practice is also like that. It has its own styles, it has its own kind of local forms of expression and so on. And that is part of what creates spaces, right? So he then goes on to kind of go into a bit more detail about this idea of the pedestrian speech act. The present, the discrete, and the phatic. Now, what does he mean by... What do you know what... Have you come across this word before, phatic? What does he mean by phatic? A bit further down that page. What is the phatic? Phatic speech. Okay, so when you're reading these texts, if there's anything you don't understand, it's really worth just checking in a dictionary or something just to save yourself some time. But the phatic is everything that's not essential to communication. It's all those sort of forms of speech like well, and how are you, and things like that. Like if you say how are you, if you say how do you do to someone, you don't actually, the correct response isn't to say, oh, I'm fine, thank you. The correct response is, how do you do? Right? So it's one of these phatic speeches, all of those little things that kind of smooth out communication but aren't actually essential to it. Okay? Does that make sense? So it's all those little sort of gestures and expressions, well, and things like that's like, so things like that are sort of in excess to communication. So let's go down to the paragraph at the bottom of page 98. First, if it is true that a spatial order organises an ensemble of possibilities, e.g. by a space in which one can move, and interdictions, e.g. by a wall that prevents one from going further, then the walker actualises some of these possibilities. In that way, he makes them exist as well as emerge. But he also moves them about and he invents others, since the crossing, drifting away, or improvisation of walking privilege, transform, or abandon spatial elements. Thus Charlie Chaplin multiplies the possibilities of his cane. He does other things with the same thing, and he goes beyond the limits of the determinants of the object set on its utilisation. In the same way, the walker transforms each spatial signifier into something else. And if, on the one hand, he actualises only a few of the possibilities fixed by the constructed order, he goes only there, here, and not there. On the other, he increases the number of possibilities, for example, by creating shortcuts and detours, and prohibitions, for example, he forbids himself to take paths generally considered accessible or even obligatory. He thus makes a selection. The user of a city picks out certain fragments of the statement in order to actualise them in secret. Okay, what responses to that section? What's he explaining here?
That whether it's like mapped out and stuff, like there are certain like ways you have to take on streets and stuff like that. There's a lot of possibility because you can implement your own rules. Like you can choose, like that one street has loads of possibilities because of the people that go down it, they've gone down another street kind of thing. Like there's lots of there's multiplicity on that like street kind of thing because what's been and come before and where you're going kind of thing, and just lots of like possibilities.
Do you know what he means when he's talking about Charlie Chaplin's cane? What Charlie Chaplin does with his cane?
Doesn't he do funny stuff? I don't know.
He sort of does everything with it except for use it to prop up his walking, right? He twirls it around and he uses it as all sorts of different kinds of tools, except as a walking stick.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of figure for everything that is in excess of functionality, I suppose. I mean, we won't read any more in detail of this text. We're going to move on to some other things now. But what do you notice about it generally in terms of thinking about spatial practice? And I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on bodies described in a sort of abstract way. But what do you notice about the kind of which bodies is it and so on? And what did you think of the text? Did you like it? Did you enjoy it? Did you find it irritating? You know.
I like the descriptions of when he's like describing like the view at the beginning, and the 97 page where he's talking about like what has been, and that bit, like the rest of it I found a bit annoying, but that's just me.
You find it a bit
annoying?
Annoying?
Yeah.
In what way?
I don't know, it was just kind of putting me to sleep. That kind of way.
Because it was hard to understand.
Yeah, I should have defined the words. Yeah.
Okay, right. What did other people find or think?
Yeah, kind of the same. There was like some really nicely described bits, but I don't know, the further through I got, the more confused I got.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to think about is, you know, what do I need to take out of this which is useful, you know, and how do I extract the kind of key ideas, and that maybe, you know, you don't need to understand every single word to kind of get a grasp. And it can be quite good sort of just to skim something first, you know, and kind of get an impression of it. I mean, one of the things that I have difficulty with this text is that it's very, very gendered, and that isn't questioned at all. And I think with spatial practice and the idea that you have choices walking down the street, well, that's very much an ideological proposition. We'll have a quick break in a minute now, but I think that's something we need to sort of perhaps go back to. And there's a big, long tradition certainly within art history, but also within writing, of the male flaneur from the 19th century. And those of you who perhaps have done a little art history or something, the flaneur will be a figure who's familiar to you. It was an upper class man who had the leisure time to wander through the streets and observe kind of the panoply of society, right? And so the flaneur was a figure that Charles Baudelaire wrote about in relation to the artist Constantine Guise, who did these sort of sketches on the fly of sort of scenarios in Paris. So, like, this is, you know, when you're talking about walkers, I think it's, and all the way through this text, he doesn't question the he in this text once, right? There's a way in which that although he's kind of criticising a sort of kind of universalism, he's also complicit within that, you know, and the gendered position of power is very definitely a masculinist one. He doesn't attempt to unpack that, I don't think. So, I mean, that's one of the problems that I have with this text, but nevertheless I think that there's things within it which are useful, and also it kind of brings that, it also brings that problem to the fore. Okay, well look, we've been doing some quite intense reading, and it's been quite hard work. We'll take a quick break now of like 5 minutes, and then we're going to sort of slightly shift gear in the second half and kind of open things up a bit more. So if you want to pop out and get a coffee or anything, you can try and be back by sort of 25 to 4. You know, very much relates to a sort of idea of structuralism. You can just take a sort of cross-section of something and almost like diagram it out. And what Auger argues in this book was that so if classic anthropology is concerned with describing societies in relation to place, which have specific sort of memories and so on, increasingly under globalization, spaces are becoming homogenized, and so we need to find new ways of understanding what he calls non-places. Now, this relationship between place and non-place is quite a sort of slippery one, but interestingly, again, we were talking about the flaneur before, and the figure in this book is a kind of international businessman who wanders through an international airport and notices that the orchid salad looks vaguely familiar and so on. So it's quite interesting the way these same kind of literary devices keep popping up. But nevertheless, it was a book that had quite a sort of impact. So non-places are spaces that are like supermarkets or airports, where increasingly places in different parts of the world seem almost interchangeable, right? And there are sort of various sort of rituals, patterns of behaviour and consumption that we know what to do in those spaces, and it's increasingly about also flow.
You know, in Playtime as well, you know, at the start of it, how they're like, I couldn't figure out whether they're in an airport or like a hospital or something. Is that kind of like a comment on that kind of same
Yes.
thing as well?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Well, there's a sort of, generic forms of furniture design and so on that are about also moving people through spaces rather than encouraging you to linger. And there's a whole, if you're interested in this, you might want to look at Anna Minton's book, which is called Fear and Happiness in the 21st Century City, because increasingly so-called public spaces, which are often actually not public, are privately owned increasingly. There's pavement design, public furniture design and so on that's designed to, say, prevent homeless people from lying down and so on. So it's about kind of policing certain kinds of behaviour or coercing certain kinds of behaviour. There was a few months ago there was a big scandal about these homelessness spikes. I don't know if you saw that, where metal spikes were inserted into spaces to prevent people from lying down. And brilliantly, one group concreted over them, which is okay. This is let's move on. This is a work that I think is now owned by the Tate, by Frances Elise. Did any of you go to the big Frances Elise show at the Serpentine a couple of years ago? Perhaps not. Okay. Well, this is a still from a 12-hour video work that Elise made, and it's shot in the Central Square in Mexico City. And basically what it shows is this flagpole, and the video sort of tracks how at various different points of the day, because of the heat, people gather under the shadow of the flagpole. And Elise is very sort of interested in these kind of patterns of behaviour, and microscopic patterns of behaviour. And so, this is a square which is like sort of overburdened with meaning. Okay, it's a square that was built with the setting up of the Republic of Mexico, Mexican Revolution, and it's a scene of where people gather for political protest and official parades and so on. But here what he's interested in is more just this everyday sort of patterns of behaviour where people aren't aware of themselves, forming a pattern. They're in fact forming a sort of clock as the sun rotates. And rhythm is one of the things that I think that is sort of implicit in de Soto's text, but nevertheless there's a lot of scope for thinking about that a lot more. And one of the books that I found very helpful with that is another book by Henri Lefebvre called Rhythm Analysis, which he wrote right at the end of his life. And in it, he distinguishes different kinds of rhythm. So there's linear time, linear rhythms, which is he describes as the time of work and the time of clocks and the time of automation. So it's that time that regulates the day. And then there's cyclical time, which is the time of night and day, of the seasons, of menstruation, of the tides, and of festivals as well. Festivals that happen on a sort of cyclical basis. And one of the sort of aspects of linear time is its sameness. Okay, whereas cyclical time is like the waves. Every time a wave comes in, it's different. Okay, and Lefebvre argues that in modern day life, increasingly these two things, cyclical time and linear time, kind of come into tension with each other. And one of the sort of forms of pressure of everyday life is the way in which our bodies, our patterns of hunger, our patterns of sleep are put into motion through the sort of the measurement of work. And there's he points out that objects are also consumers of time. So like the washing machine cycle punctuates the day as a domestic worker. So you can think about objects taking up a quantity of space, but they also take up a quantity of time. Yes.
What was the book's name again?
It's called Rhythm Analysis. It's this book, and all of these books that I'm mentioning are on the further reading list. But one of the things that he talks about, which I think is quite interesting, is when he talks about something that he calls appropriated time. One time that we shall provisionally name appropriated has its own characteristics. Whether normal or exceptional, it is a time that forgets time, during which time no longer counts and is no longer counted. It arrives or emerges when an activity brings plenitude, whether this activity be banal, an occupation, a piece of work, subtle, meditation, contemplation, spontaneous, a child's game or even one for adults, or sophisticated. This activity is in harmony with itself and with the world. It has several traits of self-creation or of a gift rather than of an obligation or an imposition come from without. It is in time, it is a time, but it does not reflect on it. So what he's doing in this book is really sort of proposing rhythm as a way of sort of thinking about everyday life and special practice. So he says, to pose the question of rhythms clearly, let us return to everyday life and the description of a day. The use of time fragments it, parcels it out. A certain realism is constituted by the minute description of these parcels. It studies activities related to food, dress, cleaning, transport, etc. It mentions the employed products. Such a description will appear scientific, yet it passes by the objects itself, which is not the sequence of lapses of time passed in this way, but their linking together in time, therefore their rhythm. The essential will get lost to the gain of the accidental, and even especially if the study of fragments enables us to theorise certain structures of the everyday. So I find this idea of appropriated time, where one forgets time, kind of interesting. Okay. Thinking about special practice, I think that this work by Pavel Alfano is kind of interesting. So it's called The Path, and it was a work that was devised for, I think it was a biennial, I don't quite remember off the top of my head, in a particular city. And what he became interested in was, Pavel Alfano, as you probably know, is a Polish artist, and what he became interested in is the way in which in this particular city people were very law-abiding when it came to sort of, cycling in the cycle lane and sticking to the routes directed by the street and so on. And so what he did was he created this path and the work just involved you followed the path, and it led out of the city and into this field, and basically after a certain point it stopped, and then the person following the path had to make up their own mind what to do, whether to carry on or return along the path or do something completely different. So he was interested in a way of sort of just kind of provoking people to think about their adherence to the way in which their kind of movements through the city were structured. Okay, we started to talk a little bit about surveillance earlier, and I mean, especially in London, which is the city which I think at a certain time may still be the case that it has the most security cameras of any city in the world. So it's we live in a city that is highly where surveillance is sort of ever present. This is work that was actually made in New York, and what she did was she made this shoe that had a camera on it, And then the video work, which is just about captured, there's just some stills. It doesn't really, the stills from the image don't really get it across, but the shoe, the camera shoe took video footage with the camera sort of pointing up her leg, and obviously what it's doing is partly kind of commenting on the way in which paparazzi shots, there's this sort of obsession with photographing female celebrities and photographing them getting out of cars, so getting the shot up between their legs and so on. So that sort of intrusive media presence. But a weird thing happens with the architecture in this video, in that her leg becomes very, very solid and monumental, and the buildings come to sort of sway around. It's quite a weird sort of surreal effect that the work has. And for some reason, that video work always reminds me of this shot by Cindy Sherman, which is part of her Untitled film series, which, as you probably know, was this very, very long, extensive photographic series in which she photographed herself in the sort of costume of sort of semi-recognisable types from classic Hollywood cinema, Hitchcock, secretaries and so on. And what's weird about this photograph here is you have this woman perhaps wearing the kind of workwear of a secretary, perhaps in a 1960s secretary in an office building, and yet these buildings around her, they almost seem to be the ones that are anxious, rather than there's something strange about this image which they somehow for me resonated together. Okay. This is a work that was made by Jean-Luc Moulin, La Vigie, and it was shown. It's sort of a work in progress, but it was shown at the Sharjah Biennial in 2010, and this is just one image from really quite a big installation. What he did was he photographed this plant that was growing out of a crack in the pavement on a particular street in Paris next to a government ministry building. And this plant came to be enclosed by a sort of security fence. And he photographed it over a sort of 7-year period at a time of kind of heightened anxiety around terrorism. And so basically this plant is it's called the Paulownia, and it comes from China, northern China and Korea. So it's an alpine plant, but it's incredibly well adapted to growing through the pavement. And it's classified in America as an invasive species. And one of the things that it was used for in China was that the stalks of it were used as packaging. So goods that were being transported would be packaged in these stalks to protect them as it went along. So that's one of the ways in which the plant sort of spread globally. And so on the one hand you have this plant, on the other hand you have one of the things that he was sort of investigating in this project was this Vigie Pirate, which is the French national security alert system. And over the course of this photographic series, it's a sort of alert system whereby the Prime Minister of France, the President of France, chooses what sort of level of terrorist threat or sort of national security threat country is in, and it's a sort of colour-coded alert system. And one of the things he's kind of interested in is the way in which a sort of so-called state of terror becomes normalised. Hi.
Sorry, I'm back again.
Okay. It's still the same.
Thank you.
Becomes normalised and every day. So the kind of architecture of terror, if you like, sort of transparent bin bags, security fences and so on become part of kind of everyday life, and we don't take notice of them any longer. So exceptional circumstances become kind of normalised. Okay. This is just some other shots from the images, and this is the installation. So. Okay, this is another project which was made in 2010 in Lisbon by two artists called Henrique Neves and Clement de Haas, and it was a project that they did inside the office of Frontiers and of Immigration and Frontiers, which is an office called CEF in Lisbon, and it's the place where people who are living temporarily or have sort of temporary status within Portugal had to go to renew their papers. And they proposed this project as a project to kind of investigate artistically how to make the space more habitable. So it's a space where people would often have to wait for kind of hours on end, and in very uncomfortable circumstances. So before we were talking about the kind of furnishings that designed to maximise flow and stopping people from lingering. Well, this is a very functional interior. Before the installation was carried out, it was there were sort of grey walls, grey flooring, and this very uncomfortable metal furniture. And then eventually people get to see a member of staff who they see through a glass barrier. And the artists asked me to, they got some money to pay for people to come and see the work, because they didn't really advertise it as open to the public, but they wanted nevertheless the work to be known about and discussed, because for the duration that the installation was up, obviously the space was in use, so they didn't really want people coming to see the work as a sort of art object, if you like, because they thought that would be not the right thing to do. So I went along and saw the work, and basically one of the things that they were interested in was kind of investigating the kind of myths of Portugal and Portuguese identity. And I mean, these toys that are at the front, they actually put those in there for children to play with, but they weren't there before. But perhaps more interesting artistically is this gold wall, and then these paintings of gardens that they've put on the walls, and the carpets that are on the benches. Obviously Portugal has a very long history of colonialism, and it has this ethnographic museum, which is a very, very strange, kind of archaic institution, kind of relic from colonialism, and it has in it this gold wall. And they started off being interested in ideas of hospitality and investigating luxury decor in hotels and so on, and eventually got interested in this ethnographic museum, which has this garden which collects seeds from all around the world. And so they made these large paintings of the gardens, but actually what they're made from is little prints of Star Wars starships, spaceships. So the idea of empire and exploration, which is part of the kind of myth of Portuguese nationality, was sort of imprinted into these images of these gardens, and also the blue and white of the paintings is a reference to azulejos, which is this kind of tile, which is you see all over buildings in Portugal, and it's thought of as sort of quintessentially Portuguese, but in fact it has it's been influenced by Moorish design and Indian design and Dutch design as well. The carpets, they were. This was one of the things that I found very interesting because they approached embassies to see if European embassies would donate Oriental carpets to them for their project. And although they had, almost all the embassies had Oriental carpets within their buildings, they didn't want to do that because they didn't think that the carpets were sort of representative of their countries, which is kind of ironic if you think of like an embassy like Germany where there's large Turkish population. But as the carpet as well has this relationship to the garden because the symbolism of Oriental carpets is often based on the image of a garden, Persian garden, which is supposed to contain all four corners of the world. So the idea was that on the one hand you'd be making the seat more comfortable and more luxurious. The idea of sort of hospitality and receiving guests was one of the things that was in their mind. But also there's an idea of a whole sort of long history of commerce and exchange between different parts of the world. So Oriental carpets are the product of years and years of many hundreds of years of trade between Europe and the Middle East and other parts of the world. And I haven't actually written about this work partly because I think that the situation, the political situation in Portugal, this was a time when the whole discourse around Fortress Europe was very present when they made this work, so partly they were kind of critiquing that. But that's also really changed now. In fact, there's a mass exodus from Portugal, people going mainly to Angola to try and find work. So the political situation has changed, but also I felt quite ambivalent about it because being invited to go and see the work, you know, when we went into the offices, it was very obvious that we were not there to get our papers sorted out. And it was quite an uncomfortable experience, and they did a lot of consultation with the people using the office, both the staff and the people coming to renew their papers, and one of the things that the staff wanted was to reinforce these barriers between them and the people they were using. So they found themselves in these quite uncomfortable situations of kind of having to negotiate these different kind of quite conflictual desires. It's just another shot. Okay, we're running really short on time. If you need to go, that's fine. Okay. So just lastly, I wanted to talk about this project by Laura Oldfield Ford. She gave a lecture, I don't know if it was last year or a couple of years ago, probably Artists' Talks. This is a project that's a zine project that Laura Oldfield Ford carried out over a number of years, sort of in the lead up to the London Olympics. And it's a zine which is sort of her response to the urban environment, and it's very sort of Benjaminian in a way, very much about sort of fragments of experiences, snatches of conversations and so on. And she's someone who lived quite a kind of precarious existence in London over quite a number of years, you know, moving between squats and rented accommodation and so on. And it's in a way it's about a whole series of subcultures which are now under erasure and were particularly in the run-up to the Olympics when large parts of East London were being sort of gentrified and cleared out to make way for the Olympic Stadium and so on. So there's a really interesting introduction to this book, which is a book made out of the different editions of the zine. Mark Fisher has written an introduction where he talks about, in a way, this is we're in a state of restoration, right? Where the kind of subcultures, which whether they're musical or social or political, that were kind of resistant to gentrification are under erasure and being forgotten. And what Laura Oldfield Ford is interested in is sort of capturing some of those fragments. And so it's sort of like quotes from texts, snatches of conversations, kind of memories of encounters and so on that she weaves together. And she's interested in those sort of abandoned spaces. And also the kind of processes of displacement through which there is that one. Often her images have heads sort of floating around, and I thought that this thing of, and quite often eyes, sometimes her own eyes, there's quite a lot of self-portraiture in the zine, and so it's a gaze which is very particular. You know, she's quite dismissive of other urban geographers like Ian Sinclair and so on. She sees them as sort of white middle class colonisers, and that her experience of London over a great many years is quite a different one. So there's these sort of portraits of herself and of friends and so on, kind of juxtaposed with photocopied photographs and so on. Okay, we'll stop there. We've kind of run out of time. Last week I mentioned that if you have work that you'd like to bring along and present, or if there's things that that are coming up in your research for your studio practice that you think are relevant to the seminar, it'd be really great if you wanted to kind of do like a 5-minute presentation on it or something. Something that we've done previously in the seminar, and it's worked really well. So I don't know if any of you have things that you would like to talk about or things that you're doing, but if you do, then just let me know. It's a really nice way of sort of steering the seminar more towards your interest, and you kind of taking some ownership of the seminar as well. Okay? Okay.
Thanks.